Minneapolis police officers in charge of training testified on day 7 of Derek Chauvin's trial, rejecting the ex-cop's actions. Jurors also heard from Sergeant Jody Steiger yesterday, a Los Angeles Police Department use of force expert. He told prosecutors the force Chauvin used was excessive. Meanwhile, the defense may have gained useful testimony that could support his argument that the ex-cop's environment made it difficult to render proper aid. For more on this, let us bring in CBS News legal expert and analyst Rikki Klieman. Rikki, good to see you. So, as I mentioned, one of the witnesses we heard from yesterday was Sergeant Jody Steiger, a use of force trainer and an expert for the LAPD. I want to play for our viewers what he told prosecutors.
Initially, when Mr. Floyd was being placed in the backseat of the vehicle, he was actively resisting the officers. So at that point, the officers were justified in utilizing force to try to have him comply with their commands and to seat him in the backseat of the vehicle. However, once he was placed in the prone position on the ground, he slowly ceased his resistance, and at that point, the officers, ex-officers, I should say, they should have slowed down or stopped their force as well.
So what was the prosecution trying to accomplish with this line of questioning, Rikki, and what kind of weight does Sergeant Steiger's testimony bear for the jury?
Sergeant Steiger comes from the Use of Force Division of the Los Angeles Police Department. Perhaps it is inside baseball, that is within the criminal justice arena, and would not have any effect on the jurors, but it is well known that the Use of Force Division of the LAPD, if not the best in the country, is one of the best in the country. They have been standard bearers for many, many years. So that is why the prosecution, in addition to the police officers and the chief of police from Minneapolis, chose to bring an expert from the LAPD. Now, will he have weight with this jury, or is the jury going to simply say, it's cumulative, he's an outsider, I really trust the chief of police and the training officers in the Minneapolis Police Department. I'd rather really believe them, and the LAPD officer really does not matter to me. It's possible, but the reality is, for those who know, we know. Now, one of the things that he does do, I think, is not only talk about what is appropriate de-escalation of force, that is, you can go from a low to a high and escalate, or a high to a low and de-escalate, depending on the circumstances. But a good fact for the defense here, which I assume they caught, is that in the police car, there is an injury to George Floyd, which then creates a whole chain of events where an ambulance is first called. That's a very important factor for the defense that has not been emphasized yet. But although we think the trial has gone on for quite some time, the trial is still young.
And Rikki, prosecutors have called several witnesses from the Minneapolis Police Department, some of whom have helped establish what policies and procedures Derek Chauvin was trained in. How critical is the testimony for the state's case, especially when they're trying to prove Chauvin's intent? And at this point, 8 days into it, does it start to seem, if you're a juror, that you're repeating yourself? In other words, you're bringing on people who are just reinforcing the narrative that you laid out very strongly in the prosecution's opening statements, and for the last week and a couple of days, you've reinforced that narrative. And if you're a juror, are you like, okay, I get it, or do you want more?
I think that there may be jurors who say, okay, I got it. I don't need another witness to tell me exactly the same thing. But I don't believe for a second that they would hold that against the prosecution. Remember this, the jurors were given a timeline for their trial service. They expect this trial to last 3 or 4 weeks. If within that time the case goes to the jury, the jurors are not going to say, oh, the prosecution really didn't have to call 4, 5, 6 experts on training in the Minneapolis PD. But if the trial went 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks, that might be another matter. We got a hint yesterday that this trial is moving along according to schedule. And how did we get that hint? the officer, the female officer, who is the person who is dealing with medical assistance, that's Mackenzie, who I could see on your screen just a second ago, that she also gives information that helped the defense, but the defense could not get enough of it because it went beyond the scope of the direct examination. So the defense said, okay, we'll recall her next Tuesday in our case in chief. Well, that says to me in one little moment that if it's not Tuesday, at least sometime next week, the defense thinks that they are going to go forward, which means that the prosecution would rest at the end of this week or the beginning of next week. That's well within the timeline allotted. Do I think there are too many well, let me rephrase that. Do I think there are too many Minneapolis police officers testifying to exactly the same point? I think that it may be one or two too many, but it doesn't matter. They're each articulate, they're each thoughtful, they each show what the training was. Let me add one more thing, Vlad, that I think is important that may or may not come up during jury deliberations, because we won't know what happens in that closed room. Just because a police officer does something that is what we call out of policy, that it does not adhere to the current standards of use of force that are taught within the department, something out of policy is not the same as something illegal. Something illegal or criminal must be proven to the jury beyond a reasonable doubt. And that goes farther than the question of whether or not it was in the training.
Really interesting. So, Rikki, does regarding police policy or current training mean something is a criminal act? You know, I had this conversation with Jessica Levinson yesterday because I was just trying to put it in layman's terms, you know, the standards that we are all held to, for example, at our jobs, about what you can and you can't do, how you should treat employees, you know, how you file business expense reports, et cetera. That is the standards that are set by companies. That is the standard that is set by law. In some cases, you can't do certain things, and if you do them, or if you don't abide by them, bad things can happen. So I'm just wondering, like, is there a distinction made between, hey, you're not in the field with me every single day, the situation is fluid, and so, you know, we've seen, I guess the point I'm trying to make, Rikki, is we've seen, a lot of people, like, imagine it's like the movies, right? The cop goes into the chief reams the cop and says, you know, you're not playing by the book, and the cop says, you know, I'm out there on the streets, and you don't know what it's like because you're sitting up here in the office, and I got to do what I got to do to, you know, bring the criminals down, and everybody applauds that. Yeah, he's, you know, not by the book kind of a police officer, but does that really work in the real world?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head, which is, let's say within our workplace that you said something that was not permitted by our own policy manual. Well, you might get fired, but it doesn't mean you're going to be prosecuted. So here, the fact that these police officers got fired doesn't mean that they're going to be convicted of a crime. I remember once a police officer, in fact, in Los Angeles, who was high up on the chain, taking a look back at a very hideous police incident. And he said to me, I don't know if it's illegal, but I always know if it's unethical. And I'll never forget him saying that to me. So what the prosecution is doing here is bringing witness after witness to say this is not what we teach our police officers. This is not in our training. It is not appropriate in our training. And then some go farther to say that the amount of force that Derek Chauvin used was unnecessary or excessive. Well, it's up to the jury to decide if what he did was criminal. One of the difficulties in explaining all of this is our viewers may simply say, well, for heaven's sake, doesn't she understand, meaning me, doesn't she understand that we all saw this video? Well, what we saw was certainly hideous. And we can all have our own beliefs about what should ultimately happen to Derek Chauvin. but it is up to 12 citizens to make that final decision. And they have four choices. They have three crimes, and of course, they have the right to acquit. I think that the defense at this point has a really big road to hoe because the prosecution is so strong. We all can see 9 minutes and 29 seconds of that video, and we all can recoil from it. It is hideous. It is unthinkable. So for the public, of course, they have pronounced the ultimate verdict, and one understands why. But it has to still happen in a courthouse according to due process because we live in the United States of America.
Such important analysis, Rikki, and you really made me think about it in a different way. Thank you as always. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Glenn.